So we're going to continue this chapter, chapter 16, talking about fungi today. So chapter 16 started off with plants, and we were learning about land plants and kind of the transition of organisms from aquatic organisms to terrestrial organisms, which is really nicely illustrated in plants by the mosses, ferns, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. So that was the first half of this chapter. The second half of this chapter is all on fungi. And I'll come back to this this graphic again at the end of the chapter once we talk a little bit about what fungi are and some of the features that they have. But a real common misconception about fungi is a lot of people think they're plants. And maybe at the outset, this is what you thought as well. And maybe when you were in the grocery store prior to this class, you would have thought, oh, fungus is just a plant that looks a little different, or you think it's very closely related to plants, right? But if you look up on this graphic, you can see that fungi are in a separate kingdom from the plants. They're actually in the same group as the animals. So they're much more closely related to animals than they are to land plants. So they're in Uniconta here, that kind of super kingdom, Uniconta. So they actually share a lot of similarities to animals. We're very animal-centric, and we think, well, there's no way a fungus is an animal. But in some ways it is. So we'll be looking at some of the features of fungus, and then at the end of the lecture today, I'll come back to this and we'll talk about which of those features actually are similar to animal features. Of course, we're not going to get into animals until after the test, so a week from today, or a week from Thursday. So there are lots of different kinds of fungus. There are about 100,000 species known, and they're very, very widespread. They're found in terrestrial habitats. They're found in diverse forms and functions. So they're primarily terrestrial. We don't find aquatic fungus. There is a fungus called an oomycete that's found. It's an aquatic fungus, but it's actually not really related to the other fungus. It was originally thought to be a fungus, but it's not particularly. There are a bunch that are single-celled. So Saccharomycete yeast. So yeast is a fungus. So yeast is a single-celled fungus. So when you're making bread, or if you were making beer or wine, those kinds of things, they are made with a fungus called a yeast. And it's a single-celled fungus. It might not be what you think of. It's not a mushroom, but it's a different kind of fungus. Most fungi, however, are more complex. They are multicellular. Very few of them actually have this structure that you really probably associate with the word fungus, which is the mushroom. We're going to talk about what a mushroom is. It has a very specific role in the life of a fungus. And the fungus that you're seeing, the mushroom that you see that you might see in your backyard, you might see in the woods, it's actually a very small part of the organism. Most of the organism is found underground and is something that you would barely ever see. And there are a lot of fungal species that don't make these mushroom structures. They're just the subterranean multicellular organisms. So we're going to look into that a little bit. So because they're so diverse in structure and function, they've colonized pretty much every terrestrial habitat. There are even some that are mainly found airborne. Like they've actually been, somewhere about 160 kilometers up in the air. You can find fungal spores that are just blowing around on the winds that are up in the air. So there's fungi everywhere. This is partially why if you leave something out for a long enough period of time, you might get a fungal body growing on top of it. So if you leave bread out, you might get a fungus growing on it at some point, because there's plenty of fungal spores in the air here. Okay, so the most common body structures are either multicellular filaments or single cell. And a single cell fungus is what we call a yeast. So yeast is not one particular species of fungus. It's actually a whole bunch of different species that are single-celled. There are very specific yeasts that we use for baking bread. There are bread yeasts. There are other species of yeast that are better for things like making beer or wine, but there are lots of yeast out there that are wild strains that are not things that we use. So some species will grow either as a filament or a yeast. Others will grow as both. So they might start out as a single cell, but they also might be able to be multicellular as well. Okay. So all right. So here's what a multicellular fungus looks like. Multicellular fungi have regions where their bodies are called mycelia. Mycelia are networks of hyphae. Hyphae is a chain of cells. So chain of cells here, one of these lines would be a hyphae, multiple lines here would be hyphae. And hyphae kind of grouped together, networks of hyphae are called mycelium. So really it's just a network of filaments. So of course we have special names for it in fungi. Most fungi have cell walls. So just like plants, they have a hard or structure that's outside of their cell membrane, but it's made of a protein called chitin. Anyone remember what the cell wall of a plant is made out of? Starts with a C. Chlorophyll is the pigment that's in them. It's called cellulose. Cellulose, so cellulose fibers. Cellulose is the protein that makes a plant cell wall. Fungi have a chitin cell wall. Chitin is actually the same protein that's found in the exoskeleton of lots of insects. So things like beetles or cockroaches, so the hard outer shell of a beetle or a cockroach, that's made of chitin as well. So, all right. Thanks. All right, so just like plants and animals, fungi are eukaryotic. They can be multicellular, but their filaments are called hyphae. So their cells are really long and thread-like. They're connected to each other, and when we have a pile of those, it's called hyphae. So when you see this kind of fuzzy structure growing on your fruits or bread that you leave out too long, that's fungus growing on there. Yeah. Yeah, we're going to talk about some pathogenic forms later on, so I'll show you some of that. It's just like we were talking about different bacteria, that there are good bacteria and bad bacteria. There's some bacteria that will be harmful to humans and some that are beneficial. It's the same thing with fungi. There are good and bad things that they do. There are some that produce toxic components, and we're going to talk about that later on today. So we'll talk about some of their roles. Okay, so when fungi grow, they lengthen those filaments. They lengthen those hyphae. They don't tend to get wider. They just tend to get longer, and this increases their surface area, and we'll talk about why that's important as we get into fungal nutrition. Most fungi are multicellular, but some don't have divisions. So here on the left is a multicellular hyphae. Multicellular hypha would be the singular here. You can see there's cell walls, and then there are what are called septums. Septums are the divisions between different cells. But some species grow by what's called sinusitic, which they don't have those separations between the cells. So they'll have multiple nuclei, and it's just basically one gigantic cell. And so it'll grow by lengthening that cell, and it'll keep on adding nuclei, but it won't add cell divisions. So fungi really, they move by growing. They don't swim, they don't walk, they don't fly, they don't do any real movement in the way that animals do to find their mates or to find food. What they do is they grow. So they will lengthen their cells to get closer to a neighboring fungus to reproduce, or they'll lengthen their cells to move closer to a food source, like that. So that's how they colonize new areas. We'll talk about their reproduction next, and that's how they can actually move large distances, but to move small distances, they do it by growth, by elongating. Okay, so the mushroom, which you are probably most familiar with seeing, and you might have seen in your yards, or you'll see it around campus. You might see some of these mushroom structures here. Mushroom structure is actually a reproductive structure. So the mycelia, the networks of hyphae, are typically found underground. And this is kind of a cartoon of it, but that's what they actually look like. So if you were to pull back the soil around a mushroom, you would see these white thready filaments, and that's the mycelium. That's the bulk of the fungus. The mushroom that you're seeing is actually a reproductive structure. It produces spores. It's going to release the offspring of that fungus, and because it's growing up and out, it will release them and they will actually spread out that way. So they'll spread long distances. So what you can actually do, you can cut one of those mushroom tops off. You can actually put it on a piece of paper and just let it sit for a day or two. And then if you pull back the fungal cap, there'll be a whole bunch of spores all around it. You can it's called a spore print. Very easy to do. You just cut the top off a mushroom, put it on a piece of white paper, and let it sit for a while, and it's going to release spores. Those spores are baby mushrooms or baby fungus. So then you'd have to spread them on a food source. They would grow for a while on the food source, and then when they're ready to reproduce, they're going to produce the mushrooms. All right. So here again. All right, and we'll get to that again in a second. So fungi feed by absorbing nutrients across their cells, so across those cell walls. So they are primarily decomposers, but they're really opportunistic feeders in that they will feed on things by just absorbing nutrients that are around them. So they're heterotrophic. They don't make their own food, so they don't photosynthesize. And they are chemotrophs, so they are heterotrophic chemotrophs. They will absorb chemical nutrients. They absorb nutrients from outside the body. They'll actually secrete enzymes outside of themselves to break down complex nutrients into more easily absorbed nutrients, and then they'll absorb those nutrients. So they actually do some of their initial digestion outside of their body. They'll actually secrete these enzymes. The food around them will break down, and then they'll absorb it again. So if you find a mushroom growing on a log, often that log is in the process of disintegrating. It's disintegrating because all the hyphae, all the filaments of the fungus that are growing throughout it, have been secreting enzymes into it and breaking down the molecules of that tree. So they are big-time decomposers. We'll find them on dead organic matter, so fallen trees. You'll find them in your kitchen if you let something sit out for too long. So if you let a piece of bread sit out for too long or a piece of fruit sit out for a while, fungus is going to start breaking it down. So over time it'll start just breaking it down. It'll grow around it and it'll secrete enzymes to break it down. Okay, so, all right. So how do they reproduce? So we talked a little bit about the mushroom cap being a disperser. They produce spores by sexual and asexual reproduction. So they can do either one. They can meet up with another fungus of the same species, and they can combine genetic information, and that would be sexual reproduction. But they can also disperse clones, basically, by just reproducing asexually. And those mushroom caps, or you can see these little kind of puffball-liking mushrooms, what they do is they just release a cloud of spores, and those spores will be dispersed by wind, or they might be dispersed by water, and they'll move around in their environment. So it's a really pretty effective mechanism of dispersal. And it's the reason why fungi are found most anywhere is that one of the big things is that they can be dispersed by wind. So fungal spores are everywhere. Air filters are often designed to get fungus out of the air because some fungal spores, which we'll talk about in a minute, if you breathe them in, they can be harmful to you, especially in large quantities. But guaranteed, every time you're walking around outside, you are breathing in some fungal spores. They are really everywhere because one of these mushrooms can release hundreds of thousands of spores at a time. All right. Kind of a neat thing, too, about mushrooms, and one of the reasons why they can survive so well, is that their spores don't have to grow into a new fungus immediately. They act like seeds do. They can be dormant, and they can actually survive pretty harsh conditions for a fair amount of time. So strawberries that you buy from the grocery store have fungus on them. They have fungal spores on them. They're very, very small. You don't see them. You might be able to wash them off, but they get into every little crack of that strawberry, so you might not be able to wash it off. So if you let it sit for long enough, it's going to start growing, and that's why you leave bread out, you leave a strawberry out, and eventually a fungus will grow on it, especially down here, especially when it's humid, when climate's pretty conducive for everything growing. It's going to eventually grow. So the bread that you buy from the store already has fungus on it. It's not going to hurt you in that form, but if you leave it around for long enough, it'll start growing. And the same thing's true with molds and things like that. But so fungal spores are pretty much everywhere. So they'll just wait for the conditions to be right for them to grow. Okay, so most fungi are what are called saprophytes, which means they feed on dead or decaying material. So they're decomposers like this. They're really useful for removing things like leaf litter or other debris that otherwise would just accumulate on the ground. So dead fallen trees, leaf litter, things like that, that dead organisms that have fallen in the woods, they will break down. Otherwise, those things would just keep piling up. So similar to how bacteria do. So bacteria, we talked about them being large decomposers. Fungi are also decomposers. They're very important for that. They're also really useful for things around them. So because their strategy for feeding is that they secrete enzymes to their environment, they actually make nutrients available for things around them. So we're going to talk about, I think I have a slide and a few slides about their relationship with plants. But if you imagine if you are a plant with your roots in the ground and there's a fungus living around your roots, you might actually be able to get a lot of nutrients out of that soil because the fungus is busy breaking things down externally. And if you can absorb those nutrients before the fungus absorbs those nutrients, you can use them as well. So they actually contribute to organisms around them. They make food more available for other types of organisms living near them. We're going to talk about what's going on here with the ants, which is mutualism. They actually will have this relationship with the ants, and actually they help each other. There are a few fungi that do act as parasites or pathogens, and we will look at some examples of those. And there are actually some fungi that will actively capture prey. There's this type that will actually go after nematodes, so really small worms, and will feed on the worms. So that's basically a parasite or a pathogen. That's what they do. So we'll look at some examples of that as well. Okay. So main kind of importance of fungi being in our environment is that they act as decomposers. They are really essential for terrestrial ecosystems, so land ecosystems, because they break down organic matter and recycle vital nutrients. So they're really well adapted to decompose organic material. They are second in importance to bacteria. Bacteria actually do more of this job, mostly because they're just more abundant, but fungi would be the second most important decomposer on Earth, really. They're able to break down a large variety of different kinds of nutrients, cellulose, lignin, different kinds of proteins that organisms like animals have a tough time with. So cellulose is something that's very hard for animals to break down. The enzymes that a fungus releases can break down cellulose. So if you're an organism living in the soil, you might actually live nearby a fungus, and the fungus breaks down that material. You'd be able to actually capitalize off of that and eat some of the broken down version, so breaking down cellulose into glucose. All right. So right here you can see this is what's called a shelf fungus, and it's on a broken limb, and it's in the process of breaking down that limb, and the shelf is actually the reproductive structure of it. So when you see a mushroom, you're seeing the reproductive structure, not the actual filaments that are doing the decomposing. Okay. So there are some parasites and pathogens. About 30% of fungi will feed on living organisms, either harming them or killing them. Most of the species that fungus live on are plants. So there are fungus that affect really important food crops like corn and rye. So there are fungal species that will attack living rye and corn and make it then thus kind of unedible to us. So this is corn smut. It reduces the yield of corn, so it will also make the corn not look very appetizing. So you might get an ear of corn that doesn't have all the kernels in it. That could be due to fungal growth on it. And here's a rye species. What's it called? The fungus that is growing on the rye here actually produces a substance that is poisonous to humans. So if this rye was harvested and then it was milled into flour and consumed, the poison could cause things such as gangrene, hallucinations, and temporary insanity. So there's actually, I think, do they talk about this in your book? I don't know if they do, but yeah, okay. So here in your book, if you look on page 331, it talks about a fungus that's potentially leading to the Salem witch hunt. So it could have been something like this. So grains that people normally consume have a toxic fungus growing on them. The fungus gets mixed in with the food source for the population, and the toxins that the fungus release make people act crazy and hallucinate. So someone's hallucinating, they're saying strange things, and there's one hypothesis that this is what led to the Salem witch hunt. So a lot of young women were hallucinating and seeing things, or maybe even people were thinking they were seeing these women do things that they weren't actually doing, and they started prosecuting them as witches. So, so there are fungus that can cause harm to human, and that's one of the things, is just causing problems by being in your food sources. So there are also fungal pathogens. So here's one that so it lives underground and spreads from tree to tree via these kind of shoestring-like mycelia. It spreads along the tree's roots and growing through the soil. And when it grows up, it has, or when it reproduces, it has these golden color mushrooms. And really, you're not going to see much of it, but it can actually do some damage to the tree. It can start eating away at the tree roots and eventually kill the tree that way. So some fungus will actually live off of live things. And here's what it does. So that fungus will infect the roots, and it will actually prevent them from absorbing water and minerals. So a tree with this fungus will eventually die. And it does attack a lot of really important softwood species. So if this is present in a forest, it will spread from tree to tree and eventually kill off a large portion of the forest. So it can be pretty damaging in that sense. Okay. So this is caused a lot of problems with Douglas firs. So there'll be whole forests of Douglas fir where Douglas fir will basically go extinct in that forest due to this. Okay, so this could be a problem, and then it's killing trees, but the death of trees can be a benefit to other organisms. So by killing trees, just like extinctions will open up new space for new organisms, killing trees, fungal deaths of trees, can allow new species to move into spaces and can recycle nutrients back into soil. So dead trees themselves can provide habitat for many other species. So here's the pileated woodpecker, which there's lots of down here, and dead trees are great habitat for them. They can burrow into it and build a nest. So there's lots of other organisms that will use dead trees or fallen trees as habitat space. And as well, by recycling those nutrients, they're now making nutrients available for other species. Okay, so there can be benefits to them killing stuff as well. So it's not always a bad thing. So fungi also can act as mutualists. So a mutualistic relationship means that both organisms are benefiting from it. And here's a few ways that fungi have mutualist relationships. They'll be mutualistic with plants, with some animals, with algae, with cyanobacteria, and I'm going to show you a few of these examples as we go through. So here we have endophytes, lichen, and leafcutter ants, and I'm going to go into a little more detail of this. So a mutualistic relationship is when there's two species interacting and both of them will benefit from that interaction. So the plant relationship is through mycorrhizae. So fungi and plant roots, if the fungi is not eating the plant, which would be bad for the plant, the fungi can actually be very beneficial to plants. Fungus presence on plant roots can actually improve the delivery of nutrients, minerals and nutrients and water to the plant root. So they will grow in and around the roots, and species that are not pathogenic, this is going to, just like I was saying before, the fungi are breaking down nutrients outside of the plant that can provide a source of certain nutrients that the plant has trouble accessing. They can also provide a source of water. They increase the surface area, basically, of the roots, and they'll help capture smaller droplets of water and bring them towards the root hairs so the roots can function. So some of the things that they improve the absorption of are ions like phosphate ions and other small minerals. They can help them fixing nitrogen, so there's different certain nutrients that are hard for the plant to get on their own, and the fungi are much better at absorbing those kinds of things, and they can make them available for the plant. Most plant species form these mycorrhizae, so mycorrhizae is this relationship with fungus. Even really early plants, plant fossils, you can see mycorrhizae, so it's been around for many, many, many years. And without the fungal symbiont, plants will exhibit growth deficiencies. There have been studies where they've taken these plants that are always found with fungus growing on the roots, they've removed the fungus and tried to grow the plant, and the plant doesn't grow as well. And it grows slower, it just is not nearly as healthy without the fungal symbiont. So it's such an important relationship that foresters, so people that grow wood, like they're farming wood, will actually inoculate their pine seedlings, for example, with these fungi to grow. So when they have a seedling growing in their nursery, they'll actually mix in fungus with the soil and then plant the trees. So they'll actually make sure that there's that fungal relationship, as they find their trees grow much faster and they're much healthier, much straighter than without it. Okay. All right. So another kind of symbiotic relationship that fungus produce are lichens. And you may have seen lichens around. They actually grow on a lot of the trees down here. A lichen is a symbiotic association between a fungus and a photosynthesizer, either a green alga or a cyanobacteria for the most part. So the algae or the cyanobacteria will provide carbon compounds for the fungus. They photosynthesize and they produce sugars, which the fungus will feed off of. The fungus is providing an ideal habitat. So they will provide mineral nutrients. They will also make sure that the alga remains moist. So a lot of times these will be growing in much drier climates than an alga could grow on their own. Because the fungus is really good at keeping water in, of providing this kind of ideal habitat, it allows the alga to grow in more diverse habitats. You'll find lichens growing on the sides of rocks, so really kind of extreme environments. Lichens are really common in the Arctic, where it's really harsh climate for anything to grow. They're one of the first things to grow, so in the harshest climates you'll find lichens. They're really hardy species because they take kind of the best of both. They have a really powerful, efficient photosynthesizer in the algae, and they have a really good habitat producer in fungus, and they both work together to do this, to work. All right, so the bulk of the structure is fungus, and the color that you see is usually from the alga. They're very actually important to us because they are what are called primary colonizers, and we might get into this later on in kind of the last few chapters of the class. But environments where there's nothing, it's just barren land, there's just rock, and there's really no soil at all, lichens will grow right on the side of the rock, and the fungus actually will secrete these compounds that will eat away at the rock and turn the rock into soil. And so they're actually one of the first things that grow in areas that eventually will produce a soil. So this happens post a volcanic eruption. So you have a volcanic eruption that covers everything in lava. So it's basically everything's covered in rock. Lichens will colonize first. They'll start eating away at the volcanic rock, turn it into soil, and then other organisms can land. So plants can then land in that soil and start growing. So ecosystem-wise, lichens are really important as primary colonizers, which is kind of a cool thing. So they allow things like this alga to grow in environments that they never could otherwise. All right, I said some of this. So they're found on surfaces, rocks, trees, logs, roofs. You'll find them all over the place. So if you see green spots or brown spots or something on the sides of your house or on your roof, it might be a lichen as well. Oh yeah, they'll grow right on the side of the canyon. So they're really places where you'd think nothing could possibly grow. You'll find a lichen there. It's one of the most hardy species you could ever, or types of organism you could ever see. However, they are sensitive to pollution. So they'll grow in extreme environments as long as they're extreme environments that aren't polluted. So they can be on environments where there's no soil, but they've got to have good air quality mostly. All right. So lichens between a photosynthesizer and a fungus. The last kind of symbiotic relationship that I'll talk about are mutualistic relationships with animals. And one of the coolest ones are these leafcutter ants. So leafcutter ants, like most animals, cannot digest leaf matter. So we talked about this a while ago in relation to like how cows can eat grass. And we talked about how there's bacteria in the guts of cows that help digest the grass. Leafcutter ants use fungus for this. What they do is they'll cut out pieces of leaf, they'll bring them back to the anthill, and underground, what they do is they have this farm of fungi. And they'll feed the leaves to the fungus. The fungus will grow on and around the leaf material and will be breaking down the leaf material. And then what the ants feed on is the fungus. So they actually will break off pieces of the fungus and they'll eat it, and that's where they get their nutrients from. So these ants are basically farmers. They are cultivating this fungus and feeding off of it. And so they are providing the fungus with a source of food in order for them to be able to eat the fungus. So pretty cool thing. Didn't think that other organisms farmed, did you? Probably not. All right. Okay, the last kind of thing I'm going to talk about, and then we'll have a few minutes if you have any questions for the next test. We can go back over some things. Is that they are a huge source of food for humans. So many of you might enjoy eating mushrooms. Most mushrooms you get in the grocery store are 1 or 2 species, but there are many, many different kinds of mushrooms that are edible. So there's the shelf fungus here. This is this one on the top. It says chicken of the woods under it. They actually supposedly taste a little bit like chicken. And there's some that will taste very meaty-like, and you can get burgers that are made out of mushroom that actually don't taste all that different from meat. The chanterelles, there's a whole bunch of different chanterelles. They are really gourmet mushrooms, but you can find them in the woods. So they're very popular in a lot of fancy dishes, and they're a wild mushroom. And this one is a giant puffball, and it can grow huge. When it's a full-grown thing, it can be several feet in diameter, gigantic. They're really only tasty when they're small, but they actually look a lot like a lot of poisonous mushrooms. Yeah. Yeah, if you take, so most those mushrooms that just have a mushroom cap, if you cut off the top and you put it on a piece of paper and you just let it sit for a few days, and then you peel it back, there'll be a spore pattern. So just if you look under the mushroom cap, they're called the gills of the mushroom. Those are where the spores all are grown within the mushroom cap. And so, yeah, if you just let them sit, the spores will come out on the piece of paper. Plant them, and you just spread them. So it's actually, you can actually grow mushrooms. There, you have to put in some various nutrients, but you can grow it in damp cardboard, basically. Like they'll grow most anywhere that is kind of damp and dark. So you can actually culture them by, you just put just a few different kinds of nutrients, different common minerals and things you can put on cardboard sheets. Then you just take those spores and spread them, or even just rub the mushroom cap on the cardboard, and you can grow mushrooms pretty easily. They're places that will sell, they call them mushroom farms, and you can grow at home, grow mushrooms. It's not all that difficult. You just need the right environment, the right nutrients, the right temperature. They're pretty good like that. Most of the mushrooms that you buy in the grocery store, they grow them in kind of a shallow soil with a lot of manure, very, very rich, nutrient-rich soil. But to get them to fruit, you often have to stress them out. So you have to kind of withhold nutrients from them. And because reproduction, the making of a mushroom cap, is usually their kind of last resort. They'll grow as just the hyphae for as long as they have nutrients, and then when they don't have nutrients anymore, they'll put up the mushroom caps. So I think a lot of mushroom growers, they'll cultivate them to get lots of healthy hyphae, and then they'll stop adding any more nutrients into it. The mushroom caps will grow, they cut off the mushroom caps, then they grind everything up and start again. So it's kind of because we're eating the reproductive structure, you need to do something to get them to fruit. But actually growing the hyphae is not all that difficult. All right, so truffles, if you've heard of truffles, that's a mushroom as well. Beer, cheese production, those all use fungi, using the yeasts, things like that. So there's lots of food-related products. There's also medicinal compounds, so antibiotics. A lot of antibiotics like penicillin. Penicillin is a fungus, so you can grow it. This is an example from your text, but the streak here is staph. It's a staphylococcus, so it's a bacterium. And the fuzzy thing there is penicillin. And penicillin, you can see there's a zone around the penicillin where the bacterial growth is inhibited. So a lot of fungus will release antibiotic compounds. So natural antibiotics come from fungus. So we have a lot of antibiotics that we've artificially produced by just producing the compounds that the fungus produces. But early antibiotics, people would just eat the right fungus that is producing the right compound. So you do the same thing with lichens. I think that's one of our instructor that teaches the 1011 lab. He does a lichen lab where he has you take different lichens, and first you grow up E. coli plate, and then he just puts the lichens on the plate, and you'll see that certain lichens produce these antibiotic compounds, and you'll get these rings around them where the bacteria won't grow. Okay, so besides being important for ecological functions, they're also important for humans in terms of food sources and medicinal sources. All right, so the last thing I want to do, I just want to go back briefly to this graphic, and considering many people associate fungi with plants rather than animals, and again, fungi are much closer to animals than plants. Can you think of any features of fungus that makes them similar to an animal? Anything you heard today that sounds more like an animal than a plant? All right, but plants do too. So, yeah. All right, so feeding. So they don't produce their own food. They feed on other things, and they can actually feed on living things. You're right. So just like us, we aren't decomposers, but we are heterotrophic. So heterotrophic, just like an animal. Yep, that's perfect. That's one thing. Another thing which you may not have caught is the protein that they produce. So their cell walls are made of chitin rather than cellulose. Chitin is something that's found in a lot of animals. So we'll get into that more in the next chapter. But again, things like beetles have chitin as well. So there's some similar proteins that are found. So they do have an overlap with animals that makes them different from land plants. Land plants have drastically different structures to them. They don't move like animals do, but they have a lot of similar features. So they're heterotrophic, and they produce chitin as well. Okay. All right, so that's the end of that chapter.